Look at yourself, kid. This is what happens when you refuse to show respect. With a sneer of pure contempt, Officer Harlan dumped the entire bottle of water over the man's head, soaking his $1,000 silk shirt until it clung tightly to his body. Moments earlier, Harlan had demanded a fine to overlook the fact that the gleaming supercar looked suspicious in this exclusive neighborhood. When the man refused, the humiliation turned into an open abuse of power right there in the middle of the street. Have you ever witnessed such a blatant abuse of power that it left you burning with outrage? Where are you watching this from? Hit like and subscribe because you will not believe the poetic justice waiting for you. The afternoon sun gleamed across the jet-black hood of the McLaren 720S. A powerful Black Panther rested silently beside the curb. It was the kind of car that did not merely announce wealth, it shouted it to the world. And in the quiet, carefully tended enclave of West Haven, a neighborhood of wealthy families and even older prejudices, that message landed all wrong, especially since the man stepping out of the house was black. Julian Voss, 38 years old, wore a golden silk shirt that seemed to drink in the sunlight and throw it back in brilliant flashes. He had owned the house he now stood in front of for only a short while. He was still getting used to the silence of the suburbs after a decade spent in a downtown high-rise. He still had not grown accustomed to the stairs. I was pulling a briefcase from the passenger seat when the patrol car slid to a stop behind him, lights flashing needlessly and silently. Two officers stepped out with slow, deliberate movements, a practiced intimidation tactic. The lead officer, whose badge read Harlan, was a thick-necked man in his 30s, with a face that seemed permanently set in mild disgust. His partner, Reeves, was younger, leaner, and stayed in the background with an expressionless mask. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Harlan began, voice dripping with condescension as he circled the McLaren. "That's an expensive piece of machinery to be parked in our quiet little neighborhood. You're lost, son." Julian closed the automatic door of his car with a soft click and turned to face them. He remained perfectly still, posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and searching. "No, officer. I live here," he said in a calm, steady voice that stood in stark contrast to Harlan's aggressive tone. Harlan let out a mocking chuckle. "You live here? Good one. In which house? The gardener's shed?" He stepped closer, invading Julian's personal space, his gaze traveling over the expensive shirt, the tailored pants, the polished Italian shoes. Every detail seemed to feed his contempt. License and vehicle documentation. Julian reached slowly and deliberately into his back pocket and produced a slim leather wallet. He handed over his driver's license. Harlan barely glanced at it. His eyes stayed fixed on the car. "Vehicle registration," he demanded. "It's a recent purchase. The temporary plate is in the glove box," Julian explained. "I assure you, everything is in order. I just moved into number 24. He nodded toward the imposing brick colonial house behind him. Harlan narrowed his eyes. He knew that house. A retired investment banker had lived there for decades. The idea that this man with his flashy car and silk shirt was the new owner felt like an insult to everything Harlan believed about the world. "I don't think so," he said, lowering his voice. "I think you're just driving around looking for opportunities. Cars like this attract the wrong kind of attention, and people like you behind the wheel attract mine." The slur was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Reeves shifted his weight. A brief flicker of discomfort crossed his face before it vanished. "Officer," Julian said firmly, "I don't know what problem you're trying to solve, but I haven't broken any law. I'm legally parked in front of my own house." Harlan leaned in, voice rough. "The problem is, I don't like your attitude. You come into my neighborhood with your fancy car and act like you own the place. You think the rules don't apply to you?" He paused, a greasy smile spreading. "But maybe we can fix this." A A small convenience fee, say $100 for my time, to make sure I don't have to impound this piece of junk for looking suspicious. The demand was so brazen, so insolent, that it felt almost surreal. A cold stillness settled over Julian. He was no longer simply a citizen being harassed. He was a prosecutor watching a serious crime unfold. He held Harlan's gaze. "I will not pay a bribe to anyone." The smile drained from Harlan's face. His eyes turned cold and empty. "Wrong answer, kid." He looked at the half-empty water bottle in his hand. For a split second, Julian thought Harlan might throw it at the car, but he did something worse. He stepped forward, unscrewed the cap, and with a look of pure malice poured the entire contents straight over Julian's head. The cold water cascaded down his face, soaking his hair, his neck, and the golden silk shirt until it plastered itself to his skin with shocking transparency. "Look at yourself, kid," Harlan growled, tossing the empty bottle onto the pristine lawn. "This is what happens when you don't show respect." He gestured to Reeves. "Cuff him. We're taking him downtown. We'll figure out the charges later. Resisting, maybe." "Yeah, I like that." He resisted. As Reeves approached with the handcuffs, Julian did not move. He offered no resistance. He simply stood there, soaked, eyes locked on Harlan. The calm in his gaze was terrifying. It was not the look of a defeated man. It was the look of a predator who had just watched his prey walk willingly into a perfectly set trap. Harlan, blinded by his own intolerance and hunger for power, had no idea that he had not just assaulted an ordinary citizen. He had just declared war on the very system he believed would protect him. The sterile fluorescent lights of the booking area in the 4th Precinct hummed overhead, intensifying the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Officer Harlan strode into the squad room like a conquering hero, a triumphant smile on his face. He dropped Julian's car keys into a plastic evidence bag with a theatrical flourish. The sound landed with the finality of a gavel. His partner Reeves followed a few steps behind. The earlier flicker of discomfort was now buried beneath a carefully practiced mask of indifference. The blue wall was rebuilding itself, brick by invisible brick. "You should have seen his face, Callahan," Harlan boasted to a heavy-set desk sergeant who grunted in amusement. Sitting there in his $1,000 shirt, soaked like a drowned rat. Thought his money would get him out of anything. Today, he learned a different lesson. They settled into a pair of worn chairs in front of a shared computer to write their report. It was a dance they had perfected over years of similar stops, a narrative ballet of lies and half-truths designed to be impenetrable. "All right, let's do this," Harlan said, cracking his knuckles. Observed a suspicious vehicle, a black McLaren, driving erratically through the residential district of West Haven. "I wasn't driving erratically, Frank," Reeves pointed out quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "He was parked." "Details, kid, details." Harlan waved a dismissive hand. "He was parked suspiciously. Who parks like that on the street? He was casing the place. So we initiated a traffic stop for public safety. Upon approaching the vehicle, the suspect, Mr. Julian Voss, immediately became aggressive and uncooperative. He typed with a slow, deliberate two-finger hunt and peck. Each word was a carefully chosen stone in the wall of his invention. "I wasn't belligerent," Reeves replied almost in a whisper. "He was calm, too calm. That's a form of belligerence, passive aggression. He refused to comply with lawful orders." Harlan continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident as the story took shape on the screen. "I requested his license, and he delayed providing it. Looked like he was trying to hide something. I detected a faint odor of alcohol on his breath and suspected he was intoxicated. This was something new, a classic, nearly impossible to refute addition after the fact." Reeves's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. Arguing with Frank Harlan when he was on a roll was a career-ending mistake. Harlan was a legend in the precinct, the kind of officer who always got his suspects and whose reports were airtight. He knew which words to use, which boxes to check. The subject refused to provide the vehicle registration. Harlan pressed on, inserting his own opinions and making baseless claims about property ownership in the area. When questioned further, his agitation increased. He began making veiled threats, chest puffed out. I assessed the situation and determined he posed a potential threat to officer safety. He paused and looked at Reeves with a gleam in his eyes. And here's the best part. In an attempt to de-escalate the situation, I offered him a bottle of water to calm him down. He reacted violently, snatching the bottle from my hand and pouring the contents over himself. He then assumed an aggressive posture. It was a masterpiece of fiction, a complete inversion of reality. Reeves stared at the screen, a sick feeling twisting in his stomach. It was not just a lie. It was an insult to the truth, so blatant and absolute. At that point, Harlan concluded, typing the final sentences with a flourish, we were forced to take the subject into custody. He offered minimal resistance, but the initial assault with the water bottle necessitated charges of resisting an officer and assault on a peace officer. He leaned back in his chair, admiring his work. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Let the department lawyer handle it when this goes anywhere. Mr. Gold Silkshirt will plead to a misdemeanor and pay a fine just to make it go away. That's how these things work. He clicked submit, filing the report into the official record. In his mind, the incident was over. Another offender had received his lesson. Another win for the badge. He and Reeves had told their story, and in the world they inhabited, theirs was the only story that mattered. The system was designed to believe them. It always had. He could not imagine a world where it would not. In his office, Captain Ellison was about to discover that such a world was closer than he thought. Harlan stood and stretched. Come on, I'm buying you a beer after shift. We earned it. He had no idea that the report he had just submitted did not justify the arrest. It was a signed confession to a federal crime. Julian Voss sat on the cold, hard bench of a holding cell. The damp silk of his shirt clung unpleasantly to his skin. The golden fabric, once a symbol of his success, was now a badge of his humiliation. Around him rose the usual sounds of a police station, a drunk singing off-key in a nearby cell, the muffled shouts of an argument somewhere down the hall, the rhythmic clang of steel doors. But in Julian's mind, there was only a deep, focused silence. He was not panicking. He was not angry. Anger was a hot, chaotic emotion, and what he felt now was cold, precise, and infinitely more dangerous. He observed. He documented. The officers who had arrested him had been rough, shoving him with unnecessary force into the back of the patrol car, but they had made one critical mistake. In their eagerness to process him and return to their self-congratulatory stories, they had followed standard procedure. His wallet, his keys, his watch, and his phone had been inventoried and sealed in a large Ziploc bag. Now he waited in the processing room for final paperwork before transfer to a permanent cell. A young officer, barely past 20, had been assigned to watch him. "I need to make a call," Julian said in a quiet voice. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. The young officer, whose badge read Quinn, shrugged. "If you get the chance, use it wisely." He pushed the bag of belongings across the steel table. Julian reached in and retrieved his phone. He did not search for his wife's number or his mother's. He did not look up an expensive defense attorney. His thumb moved with almost practiced ease to a contact simply labeled Langston. He pressed call. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Director Langston." "David, it's Julian," he said in a conversational tone, as if he were confirming a lunch reservation. On the other end of the line, the United States Attorney for the entire district straightened in his leather chair. Julian Voss never called his direct line unless the matter was of extreme urgency. "Julian, where are you?" I'm at the 4th precinct. I'm in custody, Julian said calmly. There's been an incident. I need you to do a few things for me, and they need to be done quietly and immediately. Officer Quinn, who had been distractedly scrolling on his own phone, looked up. There was something in the detainee's voice, an unmistakable air of authority that did not match his situation. First, Julian continued, I need you to contact the IT department. I need the body camera footage from Officer Frank Harlan, badge number 734, and his partner, Officer Reeves, badge number 812, secured and copied from roughly the time of the stop until the booking was complete. I want multiple intact copies stored on a federal server before anyone at the precinct can claim a technical malfunction. Langston was already typing, mind racing. Harlan, 734. Reeves, 8-12. Understood. What happened, Julian? Second, I need you to obtain the official report they just filed on my arrest. I'm certain it's a fabrication. I want it preserved exactly as written. It will serve as evidence. A sergeant walking past the processing area slowed, catching the mention of badge numbers and federal servers. He tried to look indifferent, but his eyes stayed locked on the man in the damp golden shirt. And third, Julian said, lowering his voice slightly, I need you to call Captain Ellison, the commanding officer here. Inform him of the situation. Tell him that Assistant United States Attorney Julian Voss is being held in his precinct on false charges and that he is to ensure my immediate and unconditional release. Tell him any further delay will be considered obstruction of a federal investigation. The word obstruction hung in the air like the blade of a guillotine. The sergeant who had overheard froze completely. Officer Quinn's jaw dropped. He stared at Julian, then at the phone in his hand, and a sudden horror spread across his face. This was no ordinary street criminal in a luxury car. I'm on it, Julian, Langston said, voice grim. Don't say another word. I have no intention of doing so, Julian replied, and hung up. He set the phone down on the table with deliberate calm. He folded his hands in his lap and held Quinn's wide-eyed stare without blinking. The young officer swallowed hard, suddenly feeling as though the room itself were a cage, and he was the one trapped inside. The sergeant who had overheard the call was already striding quickly down the hallway toward the captain's office, trying to process the implications. He had heard the name, Assistant United States Attorney. He had heard the words, Federal Investigation. The quiet afternoon at the 4th precinct was over. A storm had just made landfall directly overhead, and Officers Harlan and Reeves stood at the epicenter, completely unaware that they were about to be swept away. Captain Frank Ellison, a man whose career had been forged by navigating the treacherous waters of departmental politics, was enjoying the last sips of his afternoon coffee when his private line rang. It was a direct, uninterrupted line from headquarters and rarely brought good news. He sighed and picked up the receiver. Ellison. The voice on the other end was cold, clipped, and entirely devoid of courtesy. Captain, this is Director David Langston of the United States Attorney's Office. Ellison sat bolt upright, spilling hot coffee across his desk. He knew that name. Every law enforcement officer in the region knew it. David Langston was a titan of the bar, a man who had dismantled criminal families, corrupt politicians, and more than one dirty cop. A call from him was like watching a mushroom cloud form on the horizon. Director Langston, to what do I owe, the pleasure? Ellison stammered, fumbling for a pen. There is no pleasure, Captain. Langston's voice cut through the line like surgical steel. I'm calling because two of your officers, Frank Harlan, badge 734, and a younger officer named Reeves, badge 812, are holding one of my attorneys in your station. Specifically, they are holding Assistant United States Attorney Julian Voss. The pen slipped from Ellison's numb fingers. A wave of icy terror washed over him so intense it made him nauseous. He frantically tried to place the name. Voss. Julian Voss. It was familiar. A rising star in the U.S. Attorney's Office, known for a brilliant mind and an impeccable record in complex civil rights cases. He specialized in prosecuting police misconduct. "Sir, I believe there must be some misunderstanding," Ellison managed in a whisper. "The only misunderstanding, Captain, is on the part of your officers, who seem to believe their badges give them the right to commit serious felonies of assault and extortion." Langston's tone left no room for argument. A federal officer, Voss, was arrested in front of his own home on charges that, according to what I've been told, are completely fabricated. My office has already retrieved the body camera recordings from your servers. We have also preserved the ridiculously false police report your officers filed. It reads like a confession. Ellison's face went pale. Body camera footage, a false report. This was a complete disaster. His mind raced, calculating the consequences. This was not some internal affairs complaint that could be quietly filed away. This was a federal case. It could mean lawsuits, media scandals, Department of Justice oversight. It could mean the end of his career. "Director, I assure you I had no knowledge of this," he pleaded. "Your knowledge or lack of it is no longer the primary concern," Langston said, cutting him off. "This is what is going to happen. You are going to go to your booking area right now. You will personally escort Mr. Voss to your office. You will return his belongings and offer him your most sincere apologies. Then you will ensure he receives a police escort to his home or wherever he wishes to go. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Crystal clear, sir," Ellison said, already on his feet. "And Captain," Langston added, dropping his voice to a dangerously low register, "you will order Officers Harlan and Reeves to remain in the station. They are not to leave. They are not to speak to each other. They are not to alter any reports. They are, for all intents and purposes, evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. If they so much as think about making a mistake, I will add obstruction of justice to the growing list of charges they face. Do you understand me, Captain Ellison?" "Understood, Director. Perfectly." The line went dead. For a moment, Ellison sat frozen, the receiver still pressed to his ear. The silence in his office was deafening. Then he slammed the phone down and bolted from the room, his face twisted with barely contained panic. "Quinn, where is the new prisoner? The one Harlan and Reeves brought in?" he roared, his voice echoing through the squad room. Every head turned. Officers who moments earlier had been laughing and joking now stared at their captain, a man known for his composure, storming through the station like a man possessed. The sergeant who had overheard Julian's call met him halfway. "He's in processing, Captain, but you need to know." "I already know," Ellison snapped, brushing past him. "I know we're in deep trouble." He rounded the corner and saw Julian Voss sitting calmly on the bench. The soaked shirt was a silent indictment. Young Officer Quinn stood against the wall, looking as though he might be sick. Ellison stopped short, straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and approached Julian. The authority that usually filled his voice had vanished, replaced by something close to pleading. "Mr. Voss," he began, voice slightly unsteady, "I'm Captain Frank Ellison. A catastrophic error has been made. On behalf of the entire 4th Precinct, I offer my most sincere apologies. Please, come with me to my office." Julian looked at him with an unreadable expression. He rose slowly, with a dignity that made his disheveled appearance irrelevant. As Ellison escorted him, the murmurs in the station became a roar. The name Julian Voss spread through the building like a virus, contaminating every conversation. Time had not merely stopped, it had reversed. And for Officers Harlan and Reeves, time was about to run out completely. In the break room of the station, Officer Frank Harlan was drinking lukewarm coffee and recounting an exaggerated version of his confrontation with Julian Voss to a pair of younger patrol officers. In his telling, he was a seasoned veteran who had calmly diffused a tense situation with a delusional wannabe gangster who had more money than sense. And on top of everything, He has the nerve to claim he lives there, Harlan said with a chuckle. The arrogance of some people. You've got to put them in their place. Remind them who's in charge. I was halfway through another sip when Sergeant Callahan appeared in the doorway with a grim expression. Harlan, the captain wants to see you in his office. Now. Harlan winked at the younger officers. See? Probably wants to give me a commendation for keeping the trash out of West Haven. He drained the cup in one swallow and walked out with complete confidence. He had no reason to feel otherwise. In his long years of service, a summons to the captain's office after a successful arrest was almost always the prelude to a pat on the back. But as he walked down the main hallway, he noticed the atmosphere had changed. The usual energy of the station had been replaced by a tense, watchful silence. People avoided his eyes. Conversations died as he approached. A knot of unease began to form in his stomach. This did not feel like praise. When he reached Captain Ellison's office, the door was slightly ajar. He knocked once and pushed it open. The scene that greeted him stopped him cold. Captain Ellison stood behind his desk, pale and sweating, and seated in the visitor's chair, no longer in a wet silk shirt, but in an immaculate, perfectly tailored suit that must have been delivered just for him, was Julian Voss. Voss held a cup of coffee with an air of quiet ownership, as if the building belonged to him. The handcuffs were gone. He was no longer a victim. In their place radiated an aura of calm, lethal authority that seemed to suck the air from the room. "Officer Harlan," Captain Ellison said in a tight voice. "Close the door." Harlan obeyed, trying to process the scene. What was this man doing here? Why was he in the captain's office drinking coffee, dressed like a corporate lawyer? "Mr. Voss has decided not to press charges over the misunderstanding this afternoon," Ellison began, choosing his words with agonizing care. A wave of relief flooded Harlan, quickly followed by a resurgence of his old arrogance. Of course he wouldn't press charges. People like him never did. They made a scene and then realized it was easier just to disappear. He almost smiled. "Well, I'm glad we were able to clear this up without any harm done." Julian Voss slowly set his coffee cup onto the saucer on the captain's desk. The soft clink of porcelain against porcelain was the only sound in the room. He turned his head and looked at Harlan for the first time since the officer had entered. His eyes were like shards of obsidian. "There will be no official clarification," Julian said in a low voice heavy with weight. "And you are mistaken. Of course I will press charges, but not in the way you think." He gestured to a chair across from him. "Please, sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Harlan hesitated, searching his captain's face for guidance. Ellison gave a slight, desperate shake of the head that clearly meant, "Do whatever he says." Harlan sank into the chair. The unease in his stomach had become a sharp, piercing dread. "I've been reviewing your file, Officer Harlan," Julian continued in a conversational tone. "It's quite fascinating. A long career on the force, numerous commendations for bravery, but also a considerable number of citizen complaints. 47, to be exact. Allegations of excessive force, verbal abuse, unlawful detention, all of them, curiously, dismissed. Every single one." Harlan's mouth went dry. How had this man obtained his sealed personnel file? "You see," Julian went on, steepling his fingers, "you made a few crucial mistakes this afternoon. The first was assuming that my appearance and the car I drive defined who I am. Your second, and far more serious mistake was demanding a bribe from me. That is extortion. It is a federal crime." Harlan started to speak, to protest, to deny everything, but Julian raised a hand and silenced him instantly. "Your third mistake was inventing a story and submitting it as an official police report. That is a serious felony. And your fourth was committing aggravated assault against me, which, given my profession, carries enhanced penalties." Julian paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But your greatest mistake, Officer Harlan, was doing all of this to an assistant United States attorney. The title hit Harlan like a physical blow. An assistant United States attorney. He went pale. He felt the entire world collapsing in on him. The man he had humiliated, soaked with water, and locked in a cell was not some rich civilian. He was a heavyweight in the federal justice system. And Harlan had spent the afternoon poking that heavyweight with a stick. "You are suspended without pay, effective immediately," Captain Ellison muttered, looking anywhere but at Harlan. "Surrender your badge and your weapon." Julian watched with an unreadable expression as the color flooded back into Harlan's face in a deep, mottled flush of rage and disbelief. "You can't do this to me," Harlan snapped, looking from his captain to Julian. "This is a setup. He set me up." Julian merely raised one eyebrow. "If that is the version you wish to maintain, officer, in about 10 minutes, you will be sitting in an interrogation room with an agent from the Public Integrity Section of the FBI. I suggest you use that time to think very, very carefully about what you say next." He glanced at Captain Ellison. "And please call Officer Reeves. It's his turn." The interrogation room in the federal building was a world apart from the grubby, familiar rooms of the 4th Precinct. It was a sterile, soundproofed box painted a calm but clinical blue. There was no one-way mirror, only a small, discreet camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. The air was cool and still. To Officer Frank Harlan, it felt like a tomb. His badge and service weapon were gone, replaced by a plastic visitor's badge clipped to his civilian shirt. He felt naked, stripped of the armor of his authority. He had spent the last hour in a silent waiting room, his mind a whirlwind of denial, rage, and a growing, pure, uncontrollable fear. This could not be happening. It was a bluff, a power play by some arrogant lawyer trying to intimidate him. Voss would overreach. The union would step in. Everything would be smoothed over. It had to be. The door opened and a woman entered. She looked to be in her 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a serious demeanor. She wore a dark pantsuit and carried a slim leather portfolio. She did not introduce herself as an FBI agent or a prosecutor. She simply sat across from Harlan and opened the portfolio. "Officer Harlan," she began in a quiet, professional voice. "My name is Eleanor Graves. I'm with the Department of Justice. We are here today to discuss the events of this afternoon involving your interaction with Assistant United States Attorney Julian Voss. This is your opportunity to provide a complete and truthful account of what occurred. Your cooperation, or lack of it, will be noted." Harlan clung to the word opportunity. He was not under arrest. He was a witness. He was the victim. Even the arrogance that had protected him for years began to resurface. He would control this narrative. "I'm glad someone is finally willing to listen to the truth," he began, leaning forward, trying to project an image of sincere professionalism. "This whole thing is a misunderstanding orchestrated by Mr. Voss. He was acting suspiciously in a high-crime area." "West Haven is not a high-crime area, officer," Graves interrupted gently. "It has the lowest crime rate in the city. Please continue." Harlan hesitated for a moment, then pressed on. "He was belligerent from the moment I approached. I suspected he was under the influence of alcohol or drugs, based on his erratic behavior and dilated pupils. He was piling on the lies now, convinced that the more accusations he threw, the more credible his story would become. He refused to identify himself, insulted me, used profanity." Graves's pen scratched softly across her notepad. She did not confront him. She simply let him talk. Her expression remained impassive. That unsettled Harlan more than if she had shouted. He felt the need to fill the silence, to make her believe him. "He threatened me and my partner," he added, raising his voice with righteous indignation. "Kept saying things like, 'You have no idea who I am,' trying to intimidate us. Classic tactic. I've seen it hundreds of times." "The water bottle?" Graves asked without looking up. Harlan snorted and shook his head, as if remembering the absurdity of it all. That was the craziest part. The man was clearly unstable, yelling, getting too close. I was trying to calm him down. I offered him water to de-escalate, and he went berserk. Grabbed the bottle out of my hand, splashed it all over himself, then squared up like he wanted to fight. That's when we had to restrain him. Textbook use of the minimum force necessary to subdue an aggressive suspect. I followed protocol to the letter. He finished his monologue, breathing hard. He had told the whole story. It matched his report. It was his word, the word of a decorated veteran with a long career, against that of some rich, arrogant guy who was probably looking to score a payday from the city. Graves made one final note and closed her folder. "Thank you, Officer Harlan. That was a very detailed account." She stood. "Please wait here." She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Harlan allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. He had done it. He had presented himself as the calm professional, the victim of a deranged aggressor. Any moment now they would come back, apologize for the confusion, and he would be back out on the streets. The door opened again a short time later, but it was not Agent Graves who entered. It was Julian Voss. Behind him, another man in a suit placed a laptop on the table. Julian sat in the chair Graves had just vacated. He looked steadily at Harlan, and for the first time Harlan saw in those eyes not only authority, but a deep disappointment. "I had hoped, for your sake, that you would choose to tell the truth," Julian said quietly. "I see you have chosen a different path." He nodded to the man with the laptop. "Let's review what actually happened, shall we?" The man opened the laptop, adjusted the screen so Harlan could see it clearly, and pressed play. The interrogation room suddenly filled with the sounds of that sunny afternoon and the unmistakable voice of Officer Frank Harlan, clear as a bell, condemning him with every word. The video filling the laptop screen was not grainy or shaky or blurred. It was high-definition footage, crisp and clear, captured by the body camera mounted on Harlan's own chest. The audio was so sharp that birdsong in the trees of West Haven could be heard in the background. The recording began moments before Harlan and Reeves stepped out of their patrol car. "Look at this clown," Harlan's voice spat from the laptop speakers, thick with contempt. "I'll bet you anything it's stolen or he's a rapper. Same difference." Reeves's younger, more hesitant voice replied, "Come on, Frank. Maybe the guy just lives here in West Haven." "Yeah, right. Let's see what this turns into." In the sterile interrogation room, Harlan stared at the screen, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief. This was impossible. Body camera footage was supposed to be stored offline and activated manually. He always turned it on after the initial contact, giving himself room to deny anything that came before. He had no idea that the department had recently and secretly upgraded the systems to record continuously, uploading footage in real time to a secure cloud server, a protocol that Julian Voss himself had helped implement. The video continued. It showed Harlan's attitude, his aggressive questioning, his mocking laugh when Julian said he lived there. Every one of Harlan's lies was being systematically dismantled by the one witness he could not intimidate. The screen showed Julian calm and composed as he handed over his license. It showed Harlan barely looking at it. "I think you're looking for opportunities," Harlan's recorded voice echoed through the small room. "People like you attract my attention." The veiled racism, so ugly and potent, was now preserved forever in digital clarity. The real Harlan's face had gone from white to a sickly green. He looked at Julian, whose expression remained placid, almost academic, as if he were examining a particularly interesting piece of evidence. Then came the moment of the bribe. "Maybe we can make all this go away. A convenience fee, say, $100 for my time." The demand for extortion was undeniable, captured from Harlan's own point of view. Agent Graves, who had re-entered the room and now stood by the door, made a brief note in her pad. Next came Julian's calm refusal. "I will not pay a bribe to anyone. The camera jerked as Harlan stepped forward. The people in the room watched his own hand come into frame, the water bottle glinting in the sunlight. They heard the cap unscrew. Then the screen filled with the image of Julian's face staring directly into the lens as Harlan's own hand poured the water over his head. The audio captured Julian's sharp intake of breath, followed by Harlan's mocking voice. "Look at yourself, kid. This is what happens when you don't show respect." The final piece of the puzzle locked into place. Harlan's invented story of an aggressive suspect, an attempt at de-escalation, and a water bottle knocked from his hand was not merely false. It was a pathetic, obvious lie in the face of irrefutable evidence. Julian paused the video. The image of his own soaked face, seen from the perspective of his attacker, froze on the screen. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Harlan's ragged breathing. "You claimed I was belligerent and uncooperative," Julian said in a dangerously quiet voice. "Does that video corroborate your official testimony?" Harlan could not speak. His throat had closed. "You claimed I assaulted you by snatching a water bottle from your hand," Julian continued. "Is that what you see on the screen?" Harlan shook his head, a small, jerky movement. "Just a short while ago, in what you knew was a formal interview with a federal agent, you stated that you acted according to protocol. You created a narrative of my aggression and your professionalism." Julian leaned slightly forward. "Every word you spoke was a lie. Every sentence you wrote in your report was a lie. And every lie constitutes a separate serious felony, perjury and obstruction of justice, Officer Harlan. Those now join the charges of extortion and assault." He looked at Agent Graves. "I believe we have everything we need from Officer Harlan for now. Take him to a cell, a real one this time." As Graves escorted the shattered Harlan from the room and brought Officer Reeves in, Julian added, "I want to see if his memory is better than his partner's." Harlan rose unsteadily, barely able to stay on his feet. The arrogance and bravado were gone. All that remained was the empty shell of a man who had just watched his entire career, his freedom, and the carefully constructed world of lies he lived in collapse before a bottle of water and the unblinking eye of a camera. Officer Reeves was led into the same interrogation room less than 5 minutes after Harlan was escorted out. He was younger, less experienced, and the swagger he had displayed in the station had completely evaporated. He sat nervously in the chair, his restless eyes scanning the room, taking in the sterile walls and the cold, impersonal furniture. He looked like a man who knew he was in serious trouble but had no idea how to get out of it. Agent Graves sat across from him, her expression unchanged. Julian Voss remained standing against the back wall, a silent, imposing presence. "Officer Reeves," Graves began, "we have just concluded the interview with your partner, Officer Harlan. We are offering you the same opportunity to provide a complete and truthful account of your interaction with Mr. Voss this afternoon." Reeves swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yeah, okay, it was a routine stop. The car looked out of place. We went to check it out." He was already stumbling, trying to remember the lies he and Harlan had agreed upon. "Mr. Voss was uncooperative," he recited in a flat voice. "He wouldn't listen to to Officer Harlan. The situation escalated." "Escalated how exactly?" Graves pressed, her gaze penetrating. "He got aggressive. There was yelling. A water bottle got spilled. It all happened fast." Reeves stammered, avoiding her eyes and staring at a spot on the table. Julian pushed away from the wall and walked slowly toward the table. He pulled up a chair and sat beside Graves, directly in Reeves's line of sight. "Officer Reeves," he said in a quiet, almost gentle voice that somehow felt more unsettling than if he had shouted, "Allow me to be very clear with you about your current situation. Your partner, Frank Harlan, just spent 20 minutes in this room constructing a fantasy. He lied about every detail of our encounter. He committed perjury. He obstructed a federal investigation. As a result, he is facing a prison sentence that will likely be measured in decades, not years. Reeves's face drained of color. Decades? You are his accomplice, Julian continued. You were present. You signed the false report he filed. That makes you a co-conspirator. That makes you guilty of conspiracy. Right now, as we speak, you are on the exact same path he is. However, there is one crucial difference between you. Julian paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Reeves looked up, eyes wide, reflecting a mixture of fear and a desperate flicker of hope. The difference, Julian said, is that you are being given a choice that was not offered to him because he was the primary aggressor. You can continue repeating the lies your partner ordered you to tell, in which case you will be charged with the same crimes he faces, and you will spend a very long time in prison. Or you can tell us the truth, the entire truth, with no omissions. Right now. Agent Graves slid a sheet of paper across the table. This is a cooperation agreement, Officer Reeves. It is not immunity, but it stipulates that if you provide a complete and truthful account and agree to testify against Officer Harlan, the United States Attorney's Office will take your cooperation into consideration when determining the charges against you. It is, without exaggeration, the only chance you have of not ending up in a federal prison cell. Reeves stared at the paper as if it were a life raft. His gaze moved from the document to Julian's unblinking eyes, then to Graves's impassive face. He was trapped. The blue wall of silence was a fortress when you were inside it, protected by the system. But now the system had turned against him. The wall had become a prison, and Harlan was on the other side dragging him into the dark. I don't know, he began weakly. Let me help you decide, Julian said. He turned the laptop on the table toward Reeves and pressed play. The high-definition images came to life. Reeves watched, acutely aware of his own complicity. He saw himself standing impassively, saying nothing, while Harlan harassed Julian. He heard Harlan's racist comments, his demand for a bribe. He witnessed the assault with the water bottle. He saw it all, not from his own perspective, but from the damning, objective view of Harlan's own camera. The video was irrefutable. It was absolute. When the video ended, Reeves was visibly trembling. The lies he had been prepared to tell now seemed ridiculous, pathetic. There was no escape. He looked up, eyes filled with desperate, pleading terror. He does this, Reeves whispered, the words tumbling out. He calls it street justice. He targets people he thinks won't fight back, people who look like they don't belong. He made up the whole story, every single part of it. Mr. Voss, you were completely calm. You did nothing wrong. Harlan was just looking for a fight. I signed the report because I was scared. If you go up against Frank, he ruins your career. He makes your life hell. It got out of control. Over the next hour, Reeves confessed everything. He detailed not only the events of that afternoon, but other incidents, other falsified reports, other victims. He described Harlan's patterns, his prejudices, his methods of intimidation. He betrayed his partner completely. He chose himself. He chose the life raft. Julian listened without interruption. He had what he needed, the testimony of a cooperating witness backed by irrefutable video evidence. The case against Harlan was not merely solid, it was completely sealed. As Reeves finished, a broken, weeping man, Julian felt no triumph, only a grim sense of purpose. He had unmasked a corrupt officer. But Reeves's confession made clear that the corruption ran far deeper. The next day, the atmosphere in the United States Attorney's Office was electric. Word of the incident had spread through the building, a chilling story of brazen corruption colliding with unrelenting justice. In a sunlit conference room overlooking the city, Julian Voss stood in front of a whiteboard, flanked by Director Langston and Agent Graves. Arrayed before them was a team of the district's top prosecutors and investigators. The time for quiet maneuvering was over. It was time to strike with force. Frank Harlan and his partner Reeves were in separate federal cells. Their careers were finished. But Julian knew this was about more than two dirty cops. It was about the system that had enabled and protected them for years. "Good morning," Julian began, his voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. I was in his element now, no longer a victim in a soaked shirt, but a commander on a legal battlefield. Yesterday afternoon, I was the victim of an unlawful stop, an attempted extortion, and a physical assault by Officer Frank Harlan of the 4th Precinct with the complicity of Officer Reeves. These acts alone are serious, but what they represent is a fundamental rupture of civil rights and the rule of law in that jurisdiction. I uncapped a black marker and began writing on the whiteboard. Charge 1. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. His handwriting was sharp and precise. This is the heart of our case. Harlan, acting in his official capacity as a police officer, deliberately deprived me of my constitutional rights to be free from arbitrary seizure and excessive force. His actions were not a mistake or a misunderstanding. They were a deliberate abuse of power motivated by racial prejudice, as demonstrated by the audio from his own body camera. I underlined the charge. The room was silent. The only sound was the squeak of the marker. Charge 2. Extortion under color of official right. Under the Hobbs Act, Harlan used his position to attempt to obtain money, a so-called convenience fee, to which he had no right. His threat to seize my vehicle and arrest me if I did not comply is a textbook case of extortion. This charge alone carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. A murmur ran through the room. That was a severe penalty. Charge 3. Perjury and false statements. Julian continued writing. Both in his official written report and in his verbal statement to a federal agent, Officer Harlan knowingly and deliberately made multiple false statements. He invented an entire narrative to conceal his crimes. Every lie is a separate offense. We will charge 5 distinct counts. And Reeves, one of the prosecutors asked. Reeves confessed fully and agreed to testify, Julian replied. His cooperation will be considered, but he will not walk away clean. He will be charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. He stood by, did nothing, and signed a false report. Complicit silence is not a defense, it is a criminal conspiracy. Director Langston spoke up. Julian, the evidence is overwhelming. This is one of the strongest cases of its kind I have ever seen. We have the video, the audio, and a cooperating witness. I agree, Julian said, but we will not stop there. He turned back to the whiteboard. This morning, with a federal warrant based on Reeves's statement, we executed a search of the evidence and records rooms at the 4th Precinct. We also seized Harlan's personal electronic devices. He paused, letting the impact of his words settle. This was a major escalation. Our preliminary findings match exactly what we expected. Reeves testified that Harlan regularly engaged in this type of extortion. We have already identified a dozen cases with nearly identical reports. Traffic stops of minorities in affluent areas, followed by vague charges of resisting or disorderly conduct that were later reduced or dismissed. We believe Harlan ran a personal extortion network for years. He looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes. This is no longer just about my case. It is about every person. Officer Harlan and others like him have victimized over the years. We are opening a full pattern and practice investigation into the 4th Precinct. Every complaint ever filed against Harlan will be reopened, no matter how long ago it was made. Every case in which he was the primary witness will be reviewed. We are going to dismantle, piece by piece, the culture of corruption that allowed this to happen. The full weight of the federal government was now being brought to bear. What had begun as a single ugly incident on a quiet residential street had become the first step in a war against systemic corruption. Julian Voss was not merely seeking justice for himself. He was seeking it for the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of anonymous victims who had been intimidated, extorted, and abused by a man who believed himself above the law. The charges written on the whiteboard were not merely a legal strategy. They were a declaration that in the United States of America, no one, not even a police officer with a badge, stood above justice. The following day, the news exploded. In the main press room of the federal courthouse, a room usually reserved for announcements of major drug operations or terrorism indictments, Director David Langston and Julian Voss stood at a podium before a forest of microphones and a blinding constellation of camera flashes. The press conference had been announced only an hour earlier with a deliberately vague title: Announcement Regarding a Federal Civil Rights Investigation. The room was packed. Local anchors, national correspondents, and veteran print reporters buzzed with anticipation. Director Langston stepped to the podium with a stern, serious expression. "Good morning. We are here today to announce the unsealing of a federal indictment against two officers of the City Police Department, Officer Frank Harlan and Officer Michael Reeves of the 4th Precinct." A wave of frantic typing and murmuring swept the room. "Officer Harlan has been charged with multiple serious federal offenses," Langston continued in an authoritative voice, "including deprivation of rights under color of law, extortion, and 5 counts of perjury. Officer Reeves has been charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. Both officers were arrested this morning by federal agents and are now in federal custody." Reporters began shouting questions, but Langston raised a hand to silence them. "The details of the indictment are in the press packets you will receive after this briefing. However, the circumstances that gave rise to these charges are so serious that they demand to be described clearly." He paused, then turned and gestured toward Julian. "2 days ago, the man standing beside me, Assistant United States Attorney Julian Voss, was the victim of a crime committed by these officers. While standing in front of his own home, Attorney Voss was stopped without cause and with racial motivation. He was demanded a cash bribe and subjected to a humiliating physical assault. He was then arrested on false charges and taken to the 4th Precinct." The reporters sat open-mouthed. This was not a simple case of a dirty cop. This was an attack on a federal prosecutor. This was an attack on the justice system itself. Julian stepped to the podium. He was calm, composed, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and powerful. He did not look like a victim. He looked like the embodiment of the law. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," Julian began, his gaze moving across the faces in the crowd. "It was the product of a culture of impunity, a culture in which an officer like Frank Harlan believed for years that he could operate outside the law without consequence. He believed his badge was a shield that made him untouchable." He leaned closer to the microphones. He was wrong. In this country, a police officer's badge is not a shield against corruption. It is a symbol of the public trust. And when that trust is broken, when that power is abused, it is our solemn duty to hold the guilty accountable, swiftly and firmly. A reporter from the city's largest newspaper shouted a question. "Mr. Voss, can you confirm that this investigation extends beyond these 2 officers?" "Yes, I can," Julian confirmed without hesitation. "The Department of Justice is opening a comprehensive pattern and practice investigation into the 4th Precinct. We have established a dedicated phone line and email address for any citizen who believes they were victimized by Officer Harlan, or who has witnessed other misconduct in that precinct. We will review years of arrest records, internal affairs complaints, and use of force reports." This was a bombshell. The federal government was not merely prosecuting 2 officers. It was placing an entire precinct under a microscope. Another reporter asked, "Mr. Voss, what message do you hope this sends to other officers?" Julian's expression hardened. "The message is simple. If you are a good officer, and I believe the vast majority are, who serve your community with honor and integrity, we support you. But if you are an officer who abuses your power, who preys on the vulnerable, who violates the very Constitution you swore to protect, then we will come for you. Your badge will not protect you. The blue wall of silence will not protect you. We will find you, we will investigate you, and we will prosecute you with the full weight of the law." He finished speaking, and for a moment the room was silent. The weight of his words hung in the air. Then the questions erupted, a chaotic symphony of voices demanding answers. The story was no longer a secret confined to the walls of a police station or a federal building. It was now on every screen, every radio, every front page. The fall of Frank Harlan was a public spectacle, a warning broadcast to the entire city. And for the countless people who had suffered under his reign of petty tyranny, it was a beacon of hope that justice was finally on the way. In the weeks that followed the press conference, the federal investigation into the 4th Precinct unfolded with overwhelming force. Julian Voss and his team of prosecutors, working with the FBI, did not merely scratch the surface. They demolished the foundations of the precinct, and what they found was widespread corruption. The tip line Julian had announced was flooded with calls. Dozens of people, men and women, young and old, from every walk of life, shared stories about Officer Frank Harlan. The accounts formed a chilling, undeniable pattern. There was this college student stopped for an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror and coerced into paying $200 in cash to avoid having his car impounded. There was the single mother threatened with a call to Child Protective Services during a traffic stop unless she admitted to running a stop sign she swore she had obeyed. And there was the elderly man whose legally owned antique firearm Harlan confiscated, claiming it was illegal, then never filed the paperwork for its return. Each story represented a small tear in the fabric of justice. Taken together, they revealed a gaping hole. The investigative team examined Harlan's arrest history and cross-referenced it with the complaints Internal Affairs had buried. The data painted a damning picture. Over the course of his career, nearly 70% of the people Harlan arrested were minorities, even though his patrol areas were predominantly white. Moreover, more than 40% of his arrests for resisting or disorderly conduct were dismissed by prosecutors for lack of evidence, an astronomically high rate that should have been a red flag years earlier. The most devastating findings emerged when the team reviewed criminal cases in which Harlan had been the sole or primary witness. Knowing Harlan's methods, Julian's team began re-examining the evidence. They found the case of a young man named Marcus Reed, who had been sentenced to 3 years in prison for drug possession. Harlan had testified under oath that he saw Reed throw a bag of cocaine out the window of his car during a chase. Harlan was the only witness. But the GPS record from Reed's car, never requested by his overworked public defender, showed that the vehicle had been 2 blocks away from where Harlan claimed the incident occurred. Harlan had lied. He had framed an innocent man. Based on the new evidence, a judge ordered Marcus Reed's immediate release. He walked out of prison after serving 2 years for a crime he did not commit. His case was the first of many to be overturned. The consequences for the city were catastrophic. Every vacated conviction carried the potential for a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. The city's legal department was in a state of panic. The police chief was forced to resign in disgrace. Captain Ellison of the 4th Precinct was demoted and compelled into early retirement. The investigation also uncovered a small clique of officers within the precinct who had covered for Harlan's conduct, dismissing complaints against him and rubber-stamping his false reports. They, too, were suspended and faced federal charges. The blue wall of silence had not merely been breached, it had been completely destroyed. Julian Voss found himself at the center of the storm, but he held firm. He worked without rest, often sleeping in his office. This was no longer just his case. It was his crusade. He owed it to Marcus Reed and to every other person whose life had been shattered by Harlan's corruption. The day Marcus Reed was released, he held a press conference on the courthouse steps. He was thin and pale from his time in prison, but his voice was strong. "For 2 years I told everyone I was innocent, but no one believed me. They believed the cop. They always believe the cop," he said, searching the crowd until his eyes found Julian. "Mr. Voss listened to me. He didn't just get me out of prison. He gave me back my name. He gave me back my life." The cost of Harlan's years of terror was finally being tallied in ruined lives, stolen years, millions of taxpayer dollars, and the broken trust between a community and those sworn to protect it. His downfall was no longer about a single act of arrogance on a sunny afternoon. It was about dismantling a legacy of injustice, lie by lie. The federal courtroom was packed, a theater with standing room only for the final act of a drama that had captivated the city. Frank Harlan, stripped of his uniform and dressed in a suit that hung poorly on him, sat at the defense table. He was a shadow of the man he had been. The mocking arrogance was gone, replaced by the sunken-eyed, slack-jawed terror of a man staring into the abyss of his own future. His partner, Michael Reeves, already sentenced to a year in a low-security facility for his cooperation, was nowhere to be seen. Julian Voss, seated in the front row, not as a prosecutor, but as a victim, rose when the judge asked if he wished to make a statement. He did not look at Harlan. He addressed the court, the community, and the system itself. "Your Honor," he began in a clear, resonant voice, "I was assaulted by the defendant, but I was not his first victim. I was simply the last." For years, Frank Harlan used his badge as a weapon to terrorize the citizens he swore to protect. He preyed on the vulnerable, extorted the fearful, and lied with complete impunity. He was not a protector. He was a predator. He paused, letting his gaze travel across the courtroom. "The true tragedy of this case is not what he did to me. I have the power and resources of the United States government behind me. The tragedy is what he did to countless people who had no one to turn to, no one to fight for them. The men and women whose lives he ruined, whose freedom he stole, whose faith in justice he shattered, those are the true victims of his long and destructive career." Finally, he turned and looked directly at Harlan, who flinched and dropped his eyes to his hands. The defendant believed he was the law. He believed he was untouchable. He was a cancer on law enforcement, and for far too long, the system ignored the symptoms. But today, the system finally renders its verdict. Today, we cut out the cancer. He returned to his seat. The defense attorney offered a weak plea for leniency, citing Harlan's years of service, but the words rang hollow and meaningless against the mountain of evidence. Then the judge spoke, his voice cold with controlled fury. "Mr. Harlan, you have dishonored your badge. You have betrayed your oath. You have made a mockery of the very laws you were sworn to uphold. You were not a police officer. You were a criminal with a badge." The judge looked down at the sentencing report. "For the crimes of deprivation of rights under color of law, extortion, and multiple counts of perjury, this court sentences you to 7 years and 6 months in federal prison." A murmur of astonishment swept the room. It was a severe sentence, far longer than anyone had expected. Harlan collapsed into his chair as if struck, his face ashen. When the United States Marshals approached to take him away in real handcuffs this time, his reign was officially over. Later that evening, Julian stood on the balcony of his new home in West Haven, the quiet neighborhood he had fought so hard for. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and purple. The air was still. The silence of the suburbs no longer felt strange, it felt earned. He thought of the silk shirt, now clean and hanging in his closet, a quiet reminder of the day everything changed. His victory did not feel triumphant or joyful. It felt heavy, somber. It was necessary, unpleasant work that had been done. He had won the battle for himself and for many others, but he knew the war against injustice was far from over. His case had set a new precedent, shaking the foundations of police culture in the city. Change had begun, but it was fragile and new, something that had to be protected with constant vigilance. Justice had not been won, it had been reclaimed, and the work of keeping it safe was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. What does true justice mean to you? Is it about punishing the guilty or about healing the community they harmed? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that remind us the truth always finds its way into the light.